Maria lived on the same block in Silver Lake for 23 years. She knew every house, every family, every dog that walked past her window each morning. The Hendersons next door had 3 children who grew up playing with their grandchildren. The Nugents across the street brought her soup when she was sick. The Rodriguezes on the corner hosted a 4th of July barbecue every year that half the block attended. She does not know who lives on her street anymore, because nobody lives there anymore. They stay. The Henderson house sold 2 years ago. The family who bought it never moved in. Instead, every few days, a different car pulls into the driveway. Different people drag suitcases up the front walk. They stay for a weekend or a week, and then they leave, and new strangers arrive. The house that raised 3 children is now a hotel without a sign. The Nguyen family was evicted after their landlord discovered he could make 4 times the rent by listing on Airbnb. They moved to the Inland Empire, an hour and a half away. Maria has not seen them in 18 months. The people who now occupy their former home change weekly. They do not bring soup when neighbors are sick. They do not know their neighbors exist. The Rodriguez house still hosts gatherings, but they are not neighborhood barbecues. They are parties that begin at midnight and continue until police arrive. The guests are tourists who rented the house for a bachelor party or a birthday celebration. They do not know Maria's name. They do not care that she needs to sleep. They will be gone before anyone can hold them accountable. Maria Street has not been demolished. The houses still stand. The palm trees still line the sidewalk, but the neighborhood is gone. The community that formed over decades was disassembled in a few years by an app that turned homes into commodities and neighbors into strangers. This is happening across Los Angeles, block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood. The city is being converted from a place where people live into a place where people stay. And the people who built these communities are being pushed out to make room for those who will never know what was lost. This is a story of how Airbnb destroyed the neighborhoods of Los Angeles, how millions of strangers moved into a city that was already struggling to house its own residents, and what happens when a community discovers that its homes have been sold to the highest bidder. Airbnb began with a simple and seemingly innocent idea. 2 roommates in San Francisco could not afford their rent in 2007. They had extra space. They had air mattresses. They had a design conference coming to town that had filled every hotel. They put up a website, offered their floor to strangers, and discovered that people would pay to sleep there. The idea scaled beyond anything the founders imagined. By the time Airbnb arrived in Los Angeles, in earnest around 2010, it presented itself as a way for ordinary people to make extra money from spare rooms. The rhetoric was democratic, even revolutionary. Anyone could be a host. Anyone could be a guest. The sharing economy would disrupt the hotel industry and distribute its profits to regular people. Los Angeles seemed like the perfect market. A city of sprawl with neighborhoods that tourists wanted to experience. A city where housing costs already strained residents who might welcome extra income. A city where the entertainment industry meant constant demand for short-term accommodation from people who did not want to stay in hotels. The early adopters in LA were often exactly what Airbnb described. A homeowner renting a spare bedroom, an apartment dweller listing their place while traveling. The transactions were small-scale, genuinely person-to-person, and largely invisible to the broader housing market. But the model that began as sharing quickly became something else. The potential profits attracted investors who recognized that short-term rentals generated far more revenue than traditional leases. A 2-bedroom apartment that might rent for $2,000 monthly could generate $5,000 or more on Airbnb. The math was irresistible to anyone who prioritized returns over community. The transformation happened gradually, and then suddenly. The individual hosts who rented spare rooms were joined by operators who managed multiple properties. The homeowners who occasionally listed were joined by investors who bought specifically to rent short-term. The sharing economy became an extraction economy, pulling housing units out of the residential market and converting them to de facto hotels. Los Angeles, already facing a severe housing shortage, began losing units at exactly the moment it could least afford to lose them. The apartments that might have housed families became vacation rentals for tourists. The houses that might have anchored neighborhoods became party venues for visitors who would never return. The promise of sharing became the reality of taking. The scale of Airbnb's presence in Los Angeles is difficult to comprehend without the numbers, and the numbers are staggering. At peak operation before recent regulations, Los Angeles had over 45,000 active Airbnb listings. 45,000 units of housing removed from the residential market and converted to short-term rentals. 45,000 addresses where strangers rotated through spaces that could have been homes. The distribution of these listings reveals the impact on specific neighborhoods. Venice had among the highest concentrations, with some blocks showing more Airbnb properties than traditional residences. Hollywood, already struggling with affordability, lost thousands of units. Silver Lake, Echo Park, and other neighborhoods that had maintained economic diversity saw the diversity collapse as units were converted. The financial incentive explains the conversion rate. A one-bedroom apartment in a desirable LA neighborhood might rent for $2,500 per month to a traditional tenant. The same apartment listed on Airbnb could generate $200 per night during peak season. Even accounting for vacancy and management costs, the short-term rental might generate double the revenue. This calculation changed behavior throughout the housing market. Landlords who had maintained stable tenant relationships for decades discovered they could multiply their income by evicting long-term residents and converting to Airbnb. The tenants who received eviction notices were not being displaced by other residents who needed housing. They were being displaced by an algorithm that had determined their homes were worth more as hotels. The eviction data tells its own story. In neighborhoods with high Airbnb concentration, eviction rates increased significantly as the platform grew. The correlation between short-term rental density and resident displacement is strong enough that researchers have established it as a causal relationship. Airbnb did not just change who occupied housing, it actively pushed existing residents out. The economic extraction from neighborhoods is equally significant. The revenue generated by Airbnb listings largely leaves the communities where the rentals operate. The property owners may live elsewhere. The platform takes its percentage and sends it to San Francisco. The guests spend money in the neighborhood during their brief stays but contribute nothing to the social infrastructure that makes neighborhoods function. Meanwhile, the costs are borne locally. The noise complaints that police must address. The trash that sanitation workers must collect. The wear on infrastructure from constant turnover. The services that residential neighborhoods require are consumed by populations that pay nothing toward them. The eviction stories have accumulated into an epidemic. Each one represents a family displaced, a life disrupted, a connection to communities severed. Together, they represent a systematic reallocation of housing from those who need homes to those who want investments. Consider the Reyes family, who rented a 2-bedroom apartment in Echo Park for 12 years. They had raised 2 children there. The kids attended local schools, had friends in the building, knew the neighborhood as home. The rent was below market because they had lived there so long. Protected by Los Angeles rent control ordinances, their landlord found a way around the protections. The Ellis Act, a California law intended to allow landlords to exit the rental business, was invoked. The building was emptied. The Reyes family received their notice and their relocation payment, insufficient to secure comparable housing anywhere in the area they had called home for over a decade. The building was not demolished or converted to owner-occupied units, as the Ellis Act ostensibly requires. Wheaton Monts, the apartments, appeared on Airbnb, the same bedrooms where the Reyes children had slept, now hosted tourists who stayed 4 weekends and disappeared. The law designed to let landlords retire had been weaponized to facilitate short-term rentals. The pattern repeated across the city. The legal frameworks intended to protect tenants proved inadequate against the financial incentives that Airbnb created. Landlords discovered loopholes, hired lawyers who specialized in displacement, treated the modest penalties for violation as a cost of doing business. Some evictions were technically legal but ethically devastating. A month-to-month tenancy terminated with proper notice, a lease not renewed when it expired. No violation of law but destruction of lives nonetheless. The grandmother who had lived in her apartment for 30 years, the family who had finally found stability, the artist who had created a studio they could not replicate elsewhere, all pushed out to make room for strangers. The destinations of the displaced tell another part of the story. Some moved to other neighborhoods in Los Angeles, usually farther from jobs and schools and the connections they had built. Some moved to the Inland Empire, trading a difficult commute for housing they could afford. Some left California entirely, economic refugees from a state that had decided their homes were more valuable as investment vehicles. The evictions rippled through social networks. When a family leaves, their children leave the school. The parent volunteers disappear from the PTA. The familiar face no longer appears at the neighborhood store. Each eviction weakens the fabric that holds communities together, and enough evictions tear that fabric beyond repair. A neighborhood is more than houses arranged along streets. It is a network of relationships built over time. The parents who know each other from school pickup, the elderly residents who watch each other's homes, the informal agreements about noise and parking and behavior that make dense living tolerable, the trust that develops when you see the same faces year after year. Airbnb destroys these networks by design. The platform's value proposition depends on turnover. A listing that hosts the same guest forever generates no booking fees. The business model requires strangers cycling through constantly, each transaction generating revenue, each departure creating opportunity for another booking. The behavioral difference between residents and guests is fundamental. A resident invests in their neighborhood because they will live with the consequences. They moderate their noise because they will face their neighbors tomorrow. They maintain their property because they will see its condition every day. They participate in community because they belong to it. A guest has none of these incentives. They will be gone before consequences arrive. They will never see the neighbors they disturbed. They will not participate in community because they are not part of it. Their only relationship to the neighborhood is extractive, taking what it offers during their brief stay and leaving nothing behind. When a critical mass of properties converts to short-term rental, the neighborhood dynamics shift permanently. The remaining residents find themselves surrounded by strangers who rotate constantly. The relationships that required stability to develop cannot form. The trust that neighbors build over years cannot be established in days. The community institutions that depend on residential stability wither. The neighborhood association loses members who have been displaced. The local businesses lose the regular customers who provided predictable revenue. The schools lose the families who contributed to their communities. The churches lose the congregants who filled their pews. What remains is infrastructure without community. Streets lined with houses that are not homes. Sidewalks walked by people who will not return. The physical neighborhood persists while its social reality is hollowed out. Some longtime residents describe the sensation as haunting, living in a place they have known for decades, but no longer recognize. Watching the homes of former friends cycle through strangers, feeling like a ghost in their own neighborhood. The only remaining witness to what the place once meant. The most visible symptom of Airbnb's neighborhood destruction is the party house. Properties rented specifically for gatherings that would not be tolerated in hotels, that violate the norms of residential areas, that transform homes into venues for chaos. The party house phenomenon emerged as a predictable consequence of the platform's design. Hotels impose rules, employ security, can evict disruptive guests immediately. Airbnb properties have none of these controls. The host who lives elsewhere cannot manage what happens in their property. A guest who has already paid faces no meaningful consequences for behavior during their stay. The listings often explicitly or implicitly invite the activity. Perfect for groups. Great for celebrations. Private backyard for entertaining. Hosts understand what they are selling and price accordingly. A house that rents for $300 per night to a couple might rent for $1,000 to a group planning a party. The premium compensates for the risk, and the neighbors bear the costs. The complaints from affected residents are remarkably consistent. The gatherings begin late and continue past midnight. The music is loud enough to penetrate walls and closed windows. The guests spill onto sidewalks and into streets. The parking overwhelms the block. The behavior that would be unacceptable from a neighbor is normalized because the perpetrators will be gone before anyone can hold them accountable. The police responses are inadequate. Officers can respond to noise, complaints, and issue warnings, but the party typically resumes once they leave. The citations that might be issued are addressed to the property owner, not the guests who caused the disturbance. By the time any enforcement occurs, the responsible parties have scattered to wherever they came from. Some party houses have produced tragedy. Shootings have occurred at Airbnb parties in Los Angeles, guests bringing violence to residential streets that had never seen it. The victims are sometimes the partygoers themselves, sometimes innocent neighbors caught in crossfire meant for someone else. The property owners express shock while counting the revenue their listings generated. Airbnb has implemented policies attempting to address the party house problem. Restrictions on certain bookings, requirements for guest verification, bans on properties that generate repeated complaints. These measures have reduced the most egregious cases but have not eliminated the fundamental tension between short-term rental and residential neighborhood. The party house is simply the extreme manifestation of a broader problem. The conversion of homes to hotels means that hotel behavior invades residential space. Even guests who do not throw parties bring patterns inappropriate to neighborhoods, the noise of arrivals and departures at all hours, the disregard for recycling and trash protocols, the parking in ways that inconvenience permanent residents, death by 1,000 cuts, 4 communities already weakened. The economics of Airbnb in Los Angeles have created clear winners and losers. The distribution of benefits and harms reveals who the system was actually designed to serve. The winners include the platform itself. Airbnb takes a percentage of every booking, typically around 15% combined from host and guest, with tens of thousands of listings generating hundreds of millions in bookings annually in Los Angeles alone. The company extracts enormous value from the local housing market while bearing none of the costs its presence creates. The winners include the investors who recognize the opportunity early, the individuals and companies who acquired properties specifically for short-term rental have generated returns far exceeding traditional real estate investment. Some have built portfolios of dozens of properties, operating what amount to unregulated hotel chains without the overhead or accountability that hotels require. The winners include the professional management companies that emerged to serve hosts. These companies handle listing optimization, guest communication, cleaning, maintenance, and turnover. They take their percentage while enabling hosts who could not otherwise manage short-term rentals to participate in the market. Their services professionalize an industry that pretended to be amateur. The winners, arguably, include the tourists who found alternatives to hotels. The guests who stayed in Airbnb properties often paid less than hotel rates while enjoying more space and amenities. They gained access to neighborhoods they would never have experienced from a hotel room. Their consumer surplus came at a cost they never saw and did not pay. The losers are easier to count and harder to help. The renters who lost their homes to conversion. The residents who lost their neighborhoods to turnover. The communities that lost their cohesion to strangers. The city that lost housing units it desperately needed. The losses are concentrated among those who had the least to begin with and now have less. The distributional injustice is stark. The benefits of Airbnb flow primarily to property owners and platform operators, populations that were already advantaged. The costs fall primarily on renters and communities, populations that were already struggling. The sharing economy turned out to share nothing except the burdens, which it distributed to those least able to bear them. The tax implications compound the injustice. Hotels pay transient occupancy taxes that fund city services. Airbnb operators have historically evaded these obligations, though enforcement has improved. The revenue that should have supported the communities damaged by short-term rentals was diverted to private pockets instead. Los Angeles has attempted to regulate Airbnb. The attempts have been late, insufficient, and inconsistently enforced. The regulatory failure reveals how unprepared cities were for platforms that could transform housing markets faster than governments could respond. The city's home-sharing ordinance, implemented in 2019, attempted to establish basic rules. Hosts must register and obtain certificates. Listings are limited to primary residencies. A maximum of 120 nights per year applies to properties where the host is not present. The rules seemed reasonable on paper. The enforcement has proven challenging. The registration requirement created a database but not compliance. Many operators simply ignored the requirement, calculating that the risk of penalty was lower than the cost of following rules. The platforms were initially reluctant to share data that would enable enforcement, though legal pressure has improved cooperation. The primary residence requirement was designed to prevent investment properties from operating as short-term rentals. In practice, owners found ways to claim properties as primary residences while living elsewhere. The verification mechanisms were inadequate to detect fraudulent claims. The properties that were supposed to be removed from the market continued operating. The nightcaps created their own perverse incentives. A host limited to 120 nights might raise prices to maximize revenue within the constraint. The same number of tourists concentrated into fewer nights might create more disruption than year-round operation. The policy addressed quantity without addressing the quality of impact on neighborhoods. The penalties for violation have been insufficient to deter operators making substantial profits. A fine that represents a week's revenue is simply a cost of business. The enforcement resources devoted to compliance cannot match the scale of the problem. The operators who choose to violate regulations often face no consequences at all. The regulatory patchwork across different jurisdictions creates additional challenges. Santa Monica has stricter rules than Los Angeles. Beverly Hills has different requirements than West Hollywood. The uneven landscape allows operators to shift their activities to locations with weaker oversight, pushing the problem around rather than solving it. The fundamental challenge is that regulations attempt to control a market after it is already transformed. The housing units converted to short-term rental before regulations existed are difficult to recapture. The communities damaged before rules were implemented cannot be restored by rules that come later. The regulatory response has been too slow and too weak to prevent the transformation that has already occurred. The sun sets over Los Angeles, painting the sky in the colors that draw millions of visitors each year. The palm trees, silhouette against the fading light. The city spreads across the basin, beautiful and troubled, welcoming tourists while losing residents. Somewhere in Silver Lake, Maria sits on her porch and watches strangers drag suitcases into the house next door. She does not know their names. She will never know their names. They will be gone in 3 days, replaced by other strangers who will also be gone. An endless rotation of visitors through spaces that used to hold neighbors. She remembers what the street was like when she could name every family for 3 blocks. When the children played together after school, when the adults borrowed tools and shared recipes and watched each other's homes during vacations, when the neighborhood was a community rather than a collection of rental properties. That community was not destroyed by fire or earthquake or any natural disaster. It was destroyed by an app, by an algorithm that calculated her neighbors' homes were worth more as hotels, by investors who saw opportunity in converting residencies to revenue, by a platform that took its percentage while externalizing all the costs. Los Angeles has always been a city of transients. People come seeking dreams and leave when dreams fail. The entertainment industry runs on temporary arrangements. The culture has always accommodated movement and change. But there is a difference between a city that welcomes newcomers and a city that evicts its residents to make room for tourists. The visitors who stay in Airbnb properties see a Los Angeles that looks like a neighborhood. They walk streets lined with houses. They shop at local stores. They eat at neighborhood restaurants. They believe they are experiencing authentic LA, the real city that tourists and hotels never see. What they do not see is what their presence has cost. The families displaced so they could have a bedroom. The communities dissolved so they could have an experience. The neighborhood character eroded so they could feel like locals during their weekend stay. They consume the authenticity while destroying the conditions that created it. The residents who remain navigate a changed landscape. Their neighborhoods have been hollowed out, populated by strangers who will not return their waves. Their rents have increased as housing scarcity intensifies. Their quality of life has deteriorated as hotel behavior invades residential space. They are living in a city that has decided their homes are more valuable as commodities than as communities. Los Angeles did not have to make this choice. The regulations that might have protected neighborhoods could have been implemented before the damage was done. The enforcement that might have limited conversion could have been funded and prioritized. The platform that facilitated the transformation could have been required to bear the costs it created. But the choices were made differently. The benefits were concentrated among those with property and capital. The costs were distributed to those with neither. The city that was built by generations of residents was sold to millions of strangers who will never understand what they purchased. Maria will probably leave eventually. The block she has called home for 23 years no longer feels like home. The community she helped build no longer exists. The reasons she stayed have been systematically eliminated. When Segois, another longtime resident, will be gone. Another connection to what the neighborhood once was will be severed. Another unit might convert to short-term rental, accelerating the cycle that pushed her out. And the tourists will keep coming. They will drag their suitcases up the same front walks. They will stay for their weekends and their weeks. They will leave reviews praising the location and the amenities. They will never know who used to live there. They will never know what was lost so they could stay. Millions of strangers have moved into Los Angeles. They did not mean to destroy the neighborhoods. They were just looking for a place to stay. But the destruction happened anyway, and the city they found will never be the same as the city that was sold.